From Francis Ngannou's lengthy contract dispute to him moving on with his career as a free agent, there are definitely a couple of fighters who aren't on board with this decision, much like Conor McGregor. If anything, he said it was one of the worst decisions to vacate the UFC title and leave his promotion. Now, I'm not sure if you agree with that, but you gotta admit, it had a lot of fans and fighters shocked when Ngannou decided to make the switch. After a seemingly never-ending contract dispute with the UFC, they couldn't negotiate a new deal, and that's when he announced he was going to vacate his heavyweight crown and look at a bunch of other options for his fighting career. With that said, he's got a number of offers on the table, and I'm even hinting towards a two-fight deal with Deontay Wilder that you might see later this year. But even with all these opportunities he's got, McGregor still thinks the end of his UFC stint pretty much sunk his career in the ground. As he said, he was in that performance institute, using all the equipment. There was no dough on that, you know? I mean, no one was charging him for that. He had accommodation and literally everything he wanted. Everything was sorted out, but he decided to give that up and move away from the UFC. And McGregor can't help but think it was an error. Instead, he thinks one thing would have made a difference, and that's a fight under Ngannou's belt that might have changed the situation drastically. Meanwhile, there was one thing that led to his departure. He wasn't able to negotiate fights outside of the UFC. Obviously, that was because he was tied down to the contract like a bunch of other fighters in the same situation. But for him, it was pretty frustrating. On the other hand, remember McGregor's boxing bout with Floyd Mayweather back in 2017? Yeah, there was a lot of convincing behind it right until Dana White finally agreed to stage it. Needless to say, we've all seen how successful it was. But when it came to Ngannou, White had a different stance. For instance, he claimed that the fight between Ngannou and Tyson Fury wasn't going to generate a lot of revenue. Even though they verbally agreed to the clash, there were a lot of details the UFC still couldn't sort out. And now, with no contract tying him down, he's got a bunch of offers on the table. You never know. You might end up seeing him compete in MMA, or maybe some other new venture. There are a lot of opportunities set up for him, and he's already made his decision. He's gonna fight boxing first, and then move on to MMA. In fact, he's thinking about signing with one MMA promotion as well. Nothing's a done deal yet, but that's probably where his career's headed anyway. As for PFL and ONE FC, he says they're very close. Obviously, you can't really eliminate the aspect of money either. Most of these deals are partnerships of all sorts, and he's pretty happy with that. In his words, he feels well respected, appreciated, and different. With that said, it seems like he's pretty satisfied with his decision, and it was well thought out. So then why is McGregor adamant on proving it's a dumb decision anyway? Well, maybe because White claims the former heavyweight champion rejected a historically lucrative contract. I mean, we're talking about an offer worth at least $8 million for every single fight. But clearly, that wasn't enough for him. He valued his freedom instead. For instance, he asked for sponsorship, but we all know they can't have sponsors. But that's not all. They can't have health insurance or a fighter advocate either, even though these are fairly simpler demands.
Can be restrictive, and as an independent contractor, you don't really have a say in that contract. You don't even have a right. So I can't do that.
I mean, all he's asking is for someone in the board meeting to advocate for him. But nope, the UFC isn't ready to meet those demands. So he decided to ditch the money and chose his freedom instead. But McGregor feels correct representation is pretty crucial. In fact, that was his advice to anyone who's struggling to get what they want from the UFC. And he even talked about the last stylebender, who went on to become the second highest paid active UFC fighter in 2022.
Knockdown for Adesanya. Costa trying to recover. That is it. Wow. Still undisputed. Quick night at the office for the champion, Israel Adesanya.
All thanks to his bumper new deal right before his rematch with Robert Whittaker. And that's just one example. Conor talked about other fighters who tried renegotiating deals with the UFC as well, implying Ngannou shouldn't have given up. Having said that, not everyone thinks that the transition might work out for Ngannou. UFC legend Chael Sonnen warned that he's gonna struggle throughout. Conor became the world champion, and that sparked a lot of interest from the boxing community, especially Floyd. I mean, if I pick out his his story. I could go on and on about the two-division champion who also won an interim championship. But Chael claims the UFC could trust him, and they had a great working relationship. If anything, with Dana White on stage, he had value. And that's a pretty crucial element that Ngannou decided to give up. Having said that, I know Conor's made a pretty bold prediction about his exit from the UFC. But I know a lot of you wouldn't be too quick to call him a very credible source either. I mean, have you seen the outrageous things this man has said? Yeah, there's a whole controversy out there. For starters, let's not forget the Nate Diaz bottle fight. Now, this happened early on in his UFC career. Let's face it, he's known for trash-talking his opponents. At the same time, he never really stepped over the line, and that kept his fans loyal. That was until he suffered a shock defeat by Nate back in 2015.
Got it! Conor's in serious trouble! Diaz gets the mouth! My goodness! Now he's got the back! Now! That's it! He's got the choke! He does! He has done it! He does! It is all over! Nate Diaz beats Conor McGregor!
With that, they were booked for a rematch at UFC 202 in August 2016, and let me tell you, there was a lot of hype. Meanwhile, Conor was pretty much the biggest star on the UFC roster, and he acted like it too. Like the time he made everyone wait right in the middle of a pre-fight press conference, and when he finally decided to show up, the two rivals quickly switched to trash talking as Diaz was leaving the building. Everything was still under control right until the point a water bottle began to fly toward the stage from Team Diaz. And how did Conor react to it? He threw an entire table's worth of water bottles and cans at his rival. Consequently, he had to face a fine of $150,000 and participate in an anti-bullying campaign. On top of that, he also got 50 hours of community service, but that was just one incident. There was also the referee confrontation. Back in 2017, he stormed the cage at a Bellator event in Dublin, and he literally attacked Mark Goddard then and there. Why? Well, he dived into the cage to celebrate with Charlie Ward, who scored a heavy knockdown.
My goodness! And it's all over! Just like that, Charlie Ward! He was cut, he was hurt, and man, he uncorked a shot that dropped Redmond.
But Mark told him to step down. So Conor decided to charge at the referee, and people had to step in to break the incident. And that wasn't even the end of it. He even went on to slap a member of the Bellator staff. Sure, he apologized later on social media, but was that really enough? Now, I'm not saying nothing he says is of value because of these controversies, but you gotta admit, they're a part of him. At the same time, it's pretty evident that Ngannou's pretty satisfied with his decision. Only time will tell how this works out. Until then, this was everything about Conor judging Ngannou for his UFC exit.